This marks the beginning of videotape number 2 in the deposition of James Sobek. We are back on the record at 12:20 p.m.
Mr. Sobek, I'm going to show you what we've marked as defendants exhibits F, G, and H. These are photographs that were taken by the Joplin Police Department. And you'd earlier mentioned reflectivity that you identified in those photographs. Just with the photographs there in front of you, can you tell me what you're referring to?
Yes, ma'am. This appears on all three photos. In the photographs, we have eastbound cars, which are on the upper parts of the picture, with their headlights on, pointed toward the photographer. And on the road, directly under each of the headlamps, is a reflection of those headlamps. Using Exhibit F, the closest car to the photographer has what appears to be HID headlights, in that the reflection has a bluish tone off the pavement. And then there's a green sign, and then to the viewer's right of that there's another vehicle that has its headlights on as a reflection off the pavement. And likewise, there is what appears to be some brake lights. I'm not quite sure. They're red. That's a westbound truck in the distance, and its lights are reflected off the pavement also. The principle here is that all of these intense light sources will in fact not only send light straight to the viewer, to the camera in this situation, but also, because most of these vehicles are probably on low beam, their headlamps are intensely illuminating the pavement and reflecting off that pavement as if it were a very poor quality mirror. Going to Exhibit G, we have the same circumstance. The closest of the vehicles is illuminating the pavement in the westbound lane, and anything passing in front of that is going to be appear as a dark object. And then likewise in H, there are some vehicles off in the middle of the group that is reflecting some lighting off the pavement. Now in Exhibit F, Exhibit G, there is a westbound vehicle in the passing lane, and you'll notice that its tires on the right side, the passenger side tires, are presented in silhouette against those light patterns for eastbound vehicles, and they appear to be dark. I got it here. This vehicle is heading west, but its tires right in this region here are dark objects against the lighter background. And I think the best way to mark that would be, rather than circling it, I think it would be easier to do what I'm doing is drawing a line on the left boundary of that picture and another line on the bottom boundary. And if you were to then go up and intersect those two, you would be joining where that car is. Now, if you want to circle, I can certainly do that. I need something that's going to show up, though.
I don't know if this pink will
They're
show
all
up
going to
or
be
not.
dark against dark background. Now use your Post-it.
Sure.
We'll make a small arrow out of that. I put a lime green Post-it on the exhibit. Can you see that in the video?
Yes.
And the point of that arrow is pointing to the passenger side tires on that vehicle that is headed west. And the principle I'm trying to show is that those tires appear as dark objects against the lighted background created by the eastbound vehicles. That same process would have happened with the pedestrians going across the road. They would pass in front of those reflections, occlude those reflections to a westbound driver.
Okay. What perception time have you assumed for Mr. Taylor?
If he were exposed to an abrupt event, then I would expect him, if it was an expected event, such as brake lights going on or something like that, I would expect him to respond within 1 to 1.5 seconds of that event. The appearance of pedestrians on an interstate highway is less expected. I would agree with that. And I would expect him to fully appreciate that there's something on the road moving across the road, interrupting those reflections within about 1.5 to 2 seconds. That the situation ahead is not as he would expect it to be.
And that's assuming at nighttime?
That's at nighttime, yes.
And that's assuming that there is light which would illuminate these pedestrians so that he could see movement.
Well, as you've asked the question, the answer would be yes, but
that's
my answer includes all of these various light sources that I have talked about.
And I understand that, but when you talk about all those various light sources, the perception time of him being able to see movement, that's based on your assumptions of the light sources you told me about.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And have you included reaction time and the perception time, or what reaction time have you considered?
Well, since there was no reaction on the part of Mr. Taylor until after the impact and the detectable tactile thump that he felt, he doesn't speak of that, but I'm sure that he felt something and heard it. Had he been watching down the road, keeping a clear lookout, he would have been able to react and understand that these were people on the road within that 1.5 to 2 second period. And then once he had either gone to high beam to confirm that there was in fact something out there, or when he has finally illuminated them with the more intense portions of the low beam pattern, he would have been able to react in about 1/2 second of the confirmation that there was something on the road.
And what data or information do you base that on?
The information I base it on is that if he had noticed all of the other visual cues that were out there telling him that telling all westbound motorists that there was something on the road moving across the road, then paying attention to where that was and trying to identify what it was would have allowed him to confirm that there was in fact something on the road in front of him. If we only discuss the fact that he doesn't see it, he's not looking at it, he doesn't notice any of those other cues that are noticeable, then moving into the low beam pattern, I would have expected him to actually be able to go to the brakes and start turning the steering wheel to the left within 1 to 1.5 seconds after the low beam pattern intersects Mr. Ricky's shoes.
So we're talking about 2.5 to 3 seconds?
No.
for perception reaction time.
The total perception, when I say you're exposed to a stimulus, and the correct stimulus, let's for this discussion say that it's brake lights, applying the brakes, that from the exposure to the stimulus, namely that the low beam pattern intersects the shoes, until the time the brake lights go on would be 1 to 1.5 seconds.
So using that example, are you saying if there was a car and you saw brake lights ahead of him,
Yes,
okay, that his perception reaction time total would be 1.5 to 2 seconds?
1.5 seconds, 1 to 1.5 seconds for brake lights. If there is a car close, he's following so closely that he does not want to strike the car in front of him. And if this is the first time that the brake lights have gone on, then I would expect him to also apply his brakes in 1 to 1.5 seconds. Now, if you're in heavy traffic, whether it's daytime or night, and people are braking and stopping, braking and stopping, braking and stopping, the next application of the brake lights is an expected event, something that's been happening. You've been both trained to it for years of driving and to this few minutes that this has been happening. You might be, if you're paused over the brake, you just got your foot there and you're just idling along, you can get the brakes on in 1/2 second from the time that the brakes went on the vehicle in front. But in this situation, driving down the interstate, if there's a car in front of you, say 200 feet out, and it applies the brakes, and you, or maybe even two people apply the brakes, there's something wrong, some reason that people are suddenly braking. I would expect your own brake lights to go on between 1 to 1.5 seconds after those leading brake lights came on.
Okay. And you will agree that reaction, or that perception time varies from one person to another?
I will.
And there is no established, within the scientific community, there's no established perception time that applies to all people?
As you asked the question, I don't know that I can agree or disagree. The way I would interpret that in my world is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials and a lot of other people designing highways build their highways such to take into account that 85% of drivers will respond to an object in the highway that they can see within 2.5 seconds. That's the 85th percentile. There'll be people who are even longer than that, either because they aren't looking or because they just don't see it. But that's how you build a highway, is you allow the 85th percentile 2.5 seconds of sight distance. The accident reconstruction business generally centers on 1 to 1.5 seconds, and there is a substantial group of people within that who have chosen to use 1.6 seconds as some sort of a magic number. I don't agree with that selection because, as you said, and I would agree, that there is a variance in groups of people. Not everybody will react at exactly 1.6 seconds.
And are we talking about perception or perception and reaction?
Perception and reaction.
Okay. And the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, do they have like a handbook or something that sets forth this?
Yes, it's called the Green Book,
Okay.
and I don't know that I can. It's the design guidelines for highways. It's the Green Book.
Okay. I've heard that term before. Okay. Are you familiar with studies and work that Dr. Bernard Abrams has done?
Yes, I knew Bernie fairly well when he was alive.
And do you consider his studies to be authoritative?
Some of them.
Did
There
you
were
use-
some that absolutely were not, in my opinion.
Did you use any of his studies in forming your opinions?
No.
Are you familiar with the book Human Factors in Traffic Safety?
By
By
Dr.
Dewar.
Merrill Allen?
Dewar and Olson.
That title and those authors don't go together in my mind. There are others that have written on that same subject, but not, I don't know that book.
Okay. What do you consider to be a authoritative, reliable source on human factors in traffic
Paul
safety?
Olson's books, he's got, I think he's in the 4th edition now, of Forensic Aspects of Driver Safety, I think it's entitled.
Okay.
He has a lot of good work in there. He talks about brightnesses sufficient to identify an object against a black background. I don't know that he deals with retroreflective properties at all. But that's a pretty good book.
Okay. Mr. Sobek, in your file that you brought here today that we marked as Exhibit E, there are billing statements in there. Does that reflect all of the bills that you have charged to the law firm of Johnson, Voorhees, and Martucci
To this
today?
time, yes.
Okay. And have you been asked to appear at trial?
I have not.
If you were to appear at trial, what is your charge for trial testimony?
For the actual time on the stand, it's $600 per hour.
Do you charge for travel time and expenses?
I do, if that is the sole purpose of going there, and that would be billed at $400 an hour. But I don't know when trial is scheduled for this case, but if it were reasonably close, I would probably put a substantial amount of travel on another case. I have a case also in Missouri that needs a site visit.
Okay. Do you have any other cases that you're working on for Johnson, Voorhees, and Martucci at this time?
Yes.
Okay, what are those?
One of them is Lyles v. I don't remember the last name. It involves a pedestrian struck in Rogers, Arkansas. And also a incident involving a woman riding on a motorcycle, and the driver fails to see a deer that the woman does see, and the deer strikes them. The bike goes down and she gets injured, and that took place in Joplin.
Okay, and do you know the name of any of the parties in that one?
Her name also starts with an H, but I'm mixing now the lady in this case, Allison Haskins, I guess.
It is Hopkins.
Hopkins.
Yeah.
Have you done work for Johnson, Voorhees, and Martucci in the past?
No.
Do you know how they got your name?
Yes. An associate, and I don't know if it was in the office or someone that they just have worked with, saw me testify in a case in eastern Texas involving Conway Trucking Company and R&L trucking. The Conway truck ran into the back of an R&L truck. No, I'm sorry, the R&L truck ran into the back of a Conway truck, and the question was visibility of the Conway truck from behind.
And who did you work for in that case, the plaintiff or the defendant?
Defendant,
What was the name of the attorney?
if I may have my trial list here, I can tell you. Thank you. The attorney's name was Ames Hutton, Hutton, and the caption was Beck v. Whitcomb and Conway Freight. Took place in Omaha, Texas.
Okay, thank you. Sir, do you agree that peripheral vision is decreased at night?
way you stated the question, the way I interpret what you asked, I would not.
Okay. If I'm looking down the road and I'm looking in the view of my headlights, isn't it true that my ability to see to the side with my peripheral vision is decreased?
As you've asked, there's an implication, a direct implication, that we're dependent on our headlights to see things. And it is true that the headlight beam pattern does not extend as far left and right as the peripheral sensitivity that the human eye has. So if the only source of light is the headlights, then well to the left and well to the right, there will not be enough illumination, enough contrast, and enough detected motion to pick things out. But that is so far to the left when we're talking about pedestrians and the highway speeds of 69 to 70 miles an hour, that we're not talking about something that is beyond the pattern of the headlights. And we're also not talking about a situation where headlights are the only light source. We have lots of other things that we've discussed here that give people a visual cue that there is something on the road ahead of them.
So are you stating that in your view, peripheral vision is not decreased at night?
The peripheral sensitivity of the human eye, just as the human person,
That's the question.
it is actually increased for two reasons. One, at night, the periphery is not exposed to as much light, and therefore the rhodopsin dye, which is the photosensitive chemistry in the eye, doesn't get used up, or the term is bleached as much, because you're not putting as much light over there. But in fact, now you haven't stated this in your question, but I think there may be an innate assumption that I
Sir,
want.
I'm just asking, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm just asking the question. Is the peripheral vision decreased at night?
As you've asked the question, if it's in the context of this case, I can't answer it. If I'm just a human being walking around at night and trying to see things, my peripheral sensitivity is actually increased.
Okay. Is it decreased if there is light coming from one source? And you're
From
walking
one
to-
source only?
Yes. Say a flashlight.
Is a flashlight pointed at me, or?
No, you're walking with the flashlight. Is your peripheral vision decreased if you're walking with the flashlight pointed out in front of you?
I don't think so, but it's going to depend on how you got the flashlight beam set. Most flashlights these days, you can focus the beam and spread it widely or dimly. But even then, when I hear you use the term peripheral vision, I'm talking about beyond 25 degrees to the left and beyond 25 degrees to the right. And that is not substantially decreased when you use a flashlight and point it directly ahead of you.
Okay.
Your eyes do adapt to the pattern by decreasing the pupil, and so yes, everything is decreased in that situation. But if there is no light on, if you're just walking around at night, the peripheral sensitivity is actually higher than if you say we're in the house.
So if I understand what you just said, walking with a flashlight in front of you, your ability to see outside the beam of the headlight is reduced, but the flashlight is reduced because your eyes have adapted to that light.
That's correct.
Okay.
That light meaning the headlight pattern in front of you.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes. And when you were talking earlier about Allison Haskins' clothing, in the photo you showed me on your computer, you have laid the gray card next to her gray shirt. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And you did not consider if she had been wearing the black shirt under the gray shirt or the gray
No.
black shirt over the gray shirt.
We
you?
we did consider that, and I don't know the answer to that, which way it might have been. But what I do know is that my opinions do not depend on the color of either individual's clothing, because in my understanding, it was not white enough clothing that they would have appeared as a white object against a black background in the early parts of this approach. Under all circumstances that I can see, the first cues come about because they occlude light sources and retroreflectors and reflections off the pavement. Mr. Ricky and Ms. Haskins both occlude or act as silhouetting objects against the lighter colored pavement, both from the bright sky in the distance, not very bright, but still reflecting off the road, and the light from the from the car dealership onto the road surface. So they appear as dark silhouettes, not lighter colored objects. So my opinions don't depend on the fact that Ms. Haskins had a white piece of clothing on, whether it's exposed or not.
Okay. That's all I have.
Great. Let's take a break, take a couple minutes, and we'll
We are going off the record at 12:46 PM.